Good evening and welcome to our Fourscore Speaker Series. Tonight, we are joined by author and award-winning historian, Dr. Saladin Ambar, for a discussion on his latest book, Murder on the Mississippi: The Shocking Crimes That Shaped Abraham Lincoln. The book sheds new light on Lincoln's transformation from a struggling young legislator to a man ultimately willing to risk everything to save a nation from itself. My name is Phyllis Evans, and I'm the Senior Director of Development at the Lincoln Presidential Foundation. Our foundation is the only national foundation focused on increasing access to history, educational programs, exhibits, and sites highlighting the life and legacy of Abraham Lincoln. We do our work in cooperation and partnership with others locally, nationally, and globally, with a vision for a world where freedom and democracy flourish, inspired by the life and work of Abraham Lincoln. To learn more about how you can support this mission, please visit our website at lincolnpresidential.org. Before we begin tonight's program, I'd just like to remind you that we will entertain questions from the audience, so please type them in the Q&A box below and we'll get to as many as possible. And now, please join me in welcoming our Foundation President and CEO, Erin Carlson-Mast. Erin?
Thank you, Phyllis. Greetings, and thank you all for joining us for tonight's Fourscore Speaker Series. We're delighted to welcome Dr. Saladin Ambar to discuss his newest book, Murder on the Mississippi: The Shocking Crimes That Shaped Abraham Lincoln. As the publisher notes, Murder on the Mississippi, award-winning historian and political scientist Saladin Ambar unearths the horrors that shaped a young Abraham Lincoln's worldview, pushing him to find his political voice in one of the earliest and most pivotal speeches of his career, the Lyceum Address, in which he referred to these three specific crimes. Confronted by lawlessness, racial terror, and his own inner demons, Lincoln's battle was political, deeply personal, and reflective of a nation already at war with itself. Amid a string of murders that shocked the American frontier, Lincoln faced the devastating loss of his first love, crippling debt, a dangerous brush with illness, and a descent into suicidal despair. Yet from this darkness, he emerged with a renewed purpose, one that would define his leadership in the fight for democracy, human freedom, and the rule of law. Murder on the Mississippi sheds new light on Lincoln's transformation from a struggling young legislator to a man ultimately willing to risk everything to save a nation from itself. The forces that shaped him then, violence, division, and the specter of tyranny, are forces we still reckon with today. Saladin Ambar is professor of political science and senior scholar at the Center on the American Governor at Rutgers University's Eagleton Institute of Politics. He's the winner of the Association of American Publishers' Prose Best Book Award in Government and Politics for Stars and Shadows: The Politics of Interracial Friendship from Jefferson to Obama, and his Malcolm X at Oxford Union: Racial Politics in a Global Era is in development for a feature film. He is co-director of the Democracy Committee for New Jersey's Reparations Council and was a contributor for the Lincoln Presidential Foundation's docuseries on the Lyceum Address. And I'm happy to share that that film recently won its 5th National Award for Excellence. And it's an understatement to say that we have been eagerly anticipating the publication of this book on that same subject. Dean has also served as a fact checker and contributor for the Smithsonian Channel, CNN's Race for the White House, and PBS's Metro Focus. He is also the father of teenaged triplets and lives in Philadelphia. Dean, welcome. It's so great to have you here with us.
Erin, it's great to see you again. Thank you for having me. Thank you to Phyllis for handling all of the things that need to be handled for something like this. So I really appreciate you both. Thanks for having me.
So, Dean, our audience is always keen to know about the author's journey. So please tell us what prompted your interest in history and political science? What brought you to this career?
Well, for the last 35 years, I've been teaching U.S. history as a high school teacher or teaching the presidency and American political history as a university professor. My journey into teaching came about because I was an undergrad one of these years back in, I guess I'll give you the year 1990, the first year of Teach for America's existence. And they were recruiting at Georgetown University, and I was sold on teaching as a career. So that journey brought me into education. Or that moment brought me into education and teaching U.S. history and confronting Abraham Lincoln year after year. I finally came across the Lyceum Address and was just riveted to it, and so many powerful lines in it. But I had never heard the stories of Francis McIntosh. Certainly, I had heard of Elijah Lovejoy. But that story connected to McIntosh's horrific murder, along with the murder of these gamblers in Mississippi, well, I was really intrigued, and I wanted to know, frankly, what was going on because I'd never seen those stories put together in a single narrative before, and that drew me to this book.
You've written many other books before this, so why this book now? Like, what was the moment? And I know it's, as all books are, it's something that's in development over the course of several years, but what really spurred you to write about Lincoln and this particular address now?
Well, again, these things happen in context of your life and the life of the nation. I was teaching American political thought and assigning the Lyceum Address, like a good professor should, as sort of the early political thought of Abraham Lincoln. But then when you read the themes that Lincoln is drawn to in that address, the theme of the erosion of democracy, the erosion of the rule of law, the challenges of racial violence, and what that means to the country, the idea that the country's coming together and on the brink of national suicide. Well, doesn't take a rocket scientist or a political scientist to realize, in that moment, the early 2020s, that's quite frankly what the country is dealing with. And so I wanted to tackle, I guess, Lincoln's challenges as he did, but also with an eye towards our own challenges as a polity that's really fracturing, frankly.
Yeah. The Lyceum Address is shorthand for Abraham Lincoln's address to the young man's Lyceum, which was actually titled "On the Perpetuation of Our Political Institutions." So for those less familiar, can you please explain what a Lyceum is, who these were for, and why Lincoln wanted to be part of it?
Well, lyceums were sort of democratic societies where mostly men, frankly, occasionally women, and women could eventually attend, and that's an important point because there were women in Lincoln's audience at the time. But these were forums for people to discuss democratic politics, the nature of the republic as it was, the important subjects of the day. I've likened them to sort of TED Talks. These were pithy conversations in churches or town halls, but on the theme of democracy and the theme of challenges confronting the nation. So Lincoln had the opportunity to attend any number of these while he was in Springfield, Illinois. Springfield had two lyceums at different periods of time. And if you were an up-and-coming politician or had ambitions to advance your career, this was sort of one of the stepping stones that you had to take, and he understood the importance of it.
You make a really compelling case in the book that if you want to understand how and when Lincoln formed his core political values, what drove his mutual love for freedom and self-government, then the Lyceum Address and the terrible events that gave birth to it is the place to start. That's a direct quote from your book. And it's also tied to an important challenge you make to a prevailing interpretation of Lincoln, which is that he evolved into these more expansive egalitarian thoughts versus returning to it, as you argue. So how would you summarize the main message Lincoln is trying to convey in this particular Lyceum Address? And just if you can expand upon that a little bit.
Sure. Look, I think we can understand in our own moment that there are lots of people who really are very gung-ho on law and order and the rule of law and adhering to the rule of law, and law and order needs to be adhered to and so forth. But then there's another kind of position that says racial justice and civil rights are paramount, and we really need to have a society in where all are treated equally. We're not really America unless racial justice is a key component of that. And I think what the message of the Lyceum is that, we need to marry these two things to be the country we want to be. That you can't have racial justice without law and order and the rule of law, and you can't have the rule of law unless it applies equally to all. And I think Lincoln understood, as he did for the next 25 years and the remainder of his life, that this country, if it's going to be a successful republic, will ultimately have to reconcile those two objectives, bringing them together. And that's what he does at the Lyceum.
So William Herndon, Abraham Lincoln's law partner, claimed that the murder and burning of Francis McIntosh in St. Louis, Missouri, less than 100 miles from Springfield, Illinois, is what prompted the 28-year-old Lincoln to deliver that Lyceum Address. You point to the fact that it's also significant that Lincoln included not only the incident, he references McIntosh by name in the speech, and it's the only victim of mob violence that he names in his speech. So can you please tell us, who was Francis McIntosh? Why was he in St. Louis to begin with? And how did he become the victim of this brutal mob?
Well, I appreciate you asking that question. I wish more historians paid attention to who Francis McIntosh was. I think, frankly, every American should know his story. McIntosh was born in 1811 in Pittsburgh. In fact, Pittsburgh is the a focal point for where we have the first launching of a steamboat down to New Orleans. So McIntosh becomes a steward on a steamboat in the early 1800s. He is a cook. He works on a steamboat, and he comes up from New Orleans on the last day of his life, leaving New Orleans for St. Louis. He's there in St. Louis to meet a young woman who he's fallen in love with. She's a chambermaid on another vessel. I mean, you could see the story coming together, and he is going to get off and meet her there in St. Louis, and who knows, just have a great time. He's 26. And so McIntosh he brings up with him a red jacket from New Orleans that had been gifted to him by a gambler, ironically enough. And so he's just a young man in America living that steamboat life. He's a free black man, a quote unquote a mulatto. He's biracial. And the minute he steps off the Flora, which was the name of the vessel he was working on, his life takes a shocking turn for the worse.
So you mentioned this idea of the rule of law, and a big part of that is also due process, and this idea that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. McIntosh is in St. Louis a couple decades before the Dred Scott case. How did McIntosh get caught up in this situation where the law enforcement essentially apprehended him? And what could he, a free black man from a free state, expect as far as due process in Missouri, which was a slave state at the time?
He'd be fortunate to get due process, and I think he understood that. McIntosh is commanded by a constable and a deputy sheriff once he leaves the Flora to help arrest or capture someone who is running past McIntosh. And this is before the era of uniformed policemen, right? So it's important to note that these are two white guys yelling at McIntosh to catch this man. McIntosh, as I mentioned before, has love on his mind. He doesn't have catching some runaway guy on his mind. He refuses to do so, and they arrest him instead of the other gentleman they couldn't apprehend. And, this is where we don't know, we don't have a transcript of the words that were said or told to McIntosh, but apparently he believed that if he were to be incarcerated, he may not make it out alive, may never be free again. McIntosh desperately, perhaps, completely confused or fundamentally in error, just took out his knife and launched it at one of the officers, ultimately stabbing one in the neck and killing this officer. Well, McIntosh flees. He's apprehended and brought to St. Louis's jail in the city, and there he waits his fate. And as I write in the book, had he been in another country or perhaps in a different time, he would have done he would have experienced what we all hope to experience, which is, somebody approaching you, asking you, do you want a lawyer? We'll provide one for you, and the rest of it, right? And the surviving deputy sheriff, frankly, would have had the ability to confront McIntosh in the rule of law, through the rule of law, and say to McIntosh, hey, you were in the wrong, and here's my testimony. None of that happened. A crowd surrounded McIntosh's jail cell and forcibly removed him from his cell and marched him to the outskirts of what was then St. Louis, the city boundaries, and chained him to a locust tree, where he, to the crowds, sadly, but the record is clear, to their delight, he was burned in front of them, and that those were his last moments alive, actually begging to be shot, given the pain. I included the full testimonies of people who observed, This is a bleak thing to have to talk about and cover, but I do think it's important for us as a nation to confront the realities of these atrocities as Lincoln did. And McIntosh is the only person Lincoln mentions who was a victim of these crimes. There was a Dr. Bodley who was murdered in Vicksburg. There were obviously the Vicksburg gamblers' names were known. Elijah P. Lovejoy was killed in Lincoln State, and he doesn't mention Lovejoy. There are, I think, only 5 people that are mentioned in the Lyceum, and there are 3 of them are tyrants. They're Alexander the Great, Napoleon Bonaparte, and then, of course, Julius Caesar. And then George Washington is mentioned as the Republican ideal, someone who could walk away from power. Those are the 4 men he mentions. And then, Francis McIntosh. I think it's powerful because, to be frank, I don't mean to pick on anyone, but lots of historians don't mention Francis McIntosh's name when they talk about this incident. It was something that bothered me, to be honest. And I think Lincoln is doing so for appropriate reasons. He wants to humanize McIntosh. He wants to bring a human dimension to this story, this ugly chapter in American history. And I think it's really important that he does so.
Yeah, I appreciate that you pull this out and really give us the full story and the full background of Francis McIntosh in this book. For many reasons, including the fact that if we want to understand what Lincoln's trying to do with the Lyceum Address, the fact that he is the only victim he names is obviously significant. There was a grand jury hearing about McIntosh's killing by the judge, and you gotta love the name, Judge Lawless, who essentially refuses to hold anyone who directly participated in McIntosh's brutal murder accountable. Can you share with us the legal argument there?
It's a quite striking argument. Essentially, what Judge Lawless says is that the crowd could not be helped because of the kind of euphoric feelings that were upon them, having witnessed or heard of the story of one of the men who was killed by McIntosh. The frenzy that was upon them was beyond their ability to be rational, or put them beyond their ability to be rational actors. And it was almost like a kind of, dare I say, I think I mentioned, almost like a spiritual justification for lynching. They could not be helped. They were beyond all reason at that point. And they were ultimately not even tried. This is a horrific story of the rule of law gone astray. And Lincoln clearly picks up on this as a real danger, not only to the people of St. Louis, not only to free or enslaved African Americans, but to all of us. And that, I think, is at the heart of his Lyceum Address.
Yeah, if I remember correctly in your book, while Lawless did take that approach, he does call out by name and blame abolitionist Eliza Lovejoy, saying that his writings incited people to this violence. And then Lovejoy himself is subsequently murdered by a violent mob, his printing press chucked into the Mississippi River. Is that a connection that Lincoln himself also picked up on and made? I mean, he does talk about Lovejoy, not by name, but he talks about that murder as well.
He does. He talks about, basically Lincoln says in so many words, once we begin to killing, people we don't like, and then he mentions editors of newspapers, then again, our democracy is threatened. We're in danger of committing suicide as a nation. And it's important because, Lincoln is someone who believes in the rule of law, but he also deeply believes in freedom of speech and having arguments and discussion. You don't like Lovejoy's take on slavery. You think it's a good thing. Well, then make that argument. Lovejoy obviously made, the opposite argument. He was a staunch and had become, by that point, a staunch and radical abolitionist. But Lincoln is also fighting for one of the core tenets of democracy, which is, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, the right to publish things that are uncomfortable at times. All of that was lost, not only with Lovejoy's killing, but those very principles, or at least were in danger of being lost as far as Lincoln was concerned once Lovejoy is killed. And so these things are entangled. And I think that's such an important point here. These separate murders, each of them represent core challenges to democracy. If you can kill people who are marginalized or whose activities are on the border of legality, and that wasn't the case for the gamblers of Vicksburg. The legislature had approved gambling, but people didn't like it, and so they took the law into their own hands. You don't like what McIntosh did? You think he should be killed? Well, there's a trial and a process for that. Nope, we don't care. We're going to take it into our hands. And the same with Lovejoy. You think abolitionists are crazy and problematic? Fine, make that argument. But you don't go and hunt a man down quite literally for months and then shoot him. Lincoln is beside himself with this. For a rational speech, and it's a very reasoned speech, the Lyceum Address. It is, not a polemical kind of address, but you can, I think, capture the underlying anxiety and frustration, and I think real fear and kind of the emotional content is there, given that and the poetic language is there that at times that Lincoln, maybe some people think it's overly poetic and don't care for it, but Lincoln is really making a kind of heartfelt case for why this is wrong. It's not just a reasoned, rational speech, but there's a kind of element of, hey guys, we're losing it here and we need to get it together.
Yeah. You do devote a chapter in your book to each of these three major incidents of mob violence that Lincoln references in his Lyceum Address. The killings of McIntosh and Lovejoy are the second and third. The first, you referenced a few times here, involves the killing of multiple people, including gamblers in Vicksburg, Mississippi. What did the events in Vicksburg really reveal about how social fear, economic anxiety, and created this situation where conspiracy theories and vigilante justice, these passions rather than sober reason, as Lincoln might say, were able to really take hold?
Well, look, we live in a time where misinformation, questionable information, and outright lies spread quite easily, frankly, and oftentimes it's done online. Well, there was no internet back then, but there were pamphlets. And pamphlets were highly successful publications. Lots of people read them. In fact, if you wanted to write a pamphlet for slavery or opposed to slavery, you had a good shot of it being read. Those things were ubiquitous in the 19th century. There was a guy named Virgil Stewart who created a false publication. We might call it a false, post online today, about a prospective would-be insurrection that was going to, envelop Mississippi, but it was going to be led by whites, frankly, gamblers who were instigating it. And he knew well to pick on a class of citizens who might be believable or whom people might want to be believed to be enveloped in this, because gamblers were a kind of hated class. I was fascinated to learn that the gambling that took place in Vicksburg was in the Kangaroo District, as it was called, which was named for a brothel, and from whence we get our idiom, kangaroo courts.
I loved it. That's a great future trivia out there.
I frankly, this is why you do this research, right? You write a book, you're happy, but I just learned where kangaroo court came from. I'm good, So, but these people need protection. But Stewart used the kind of prejudice, the pre-existing bias against these people to lure people into the belief that something horrible was going to happen. He went on the stump and he gave speeches about it, none of which were true. But the people of Vicksburg were informed on July 4th via notice that the gamblers of the city had 24 hours to leave or else. And that's when the hanging commenced on the very next day. But it didn't only affect the gamblers, and this is also Lincoln's point. Other whites who were suspected of being participants in the insurrection were murdered. Obviously, many blacks. We don't know how many African Americans were killed in Mississippi. And then it happened to spread beyond Mississippi to other states, which I did not know. It went from Arkansas and all the way to Washington, D.C. by the end of 1835. This became a highly publicized and renowned event. And I was also intrigued to learn that Mark Twain wrote about it in his autobiography, Life Along the Mississippi, many decades later. So All of this is to say that the exploitation of people's fears is at the heart of what took place in Mississippi, and the exploitation of people's racial fears. Drumming up support, if you will, against a class of people for the sake of what? For the sake of ridding the earth of these undesirables. And I love, frankly, I really do love and admire that Lincoln chooses these kinds of people to support uh, and to hold up, not based on their actions, but based on the fact that they're human beings and are deserving of their civil liberties being protected. And he didn't have to do that. He could have chosen more desirable people, frankly, white people who weren't criminals or engaged in unpopular behavior. No, he wants to choose the gamblers. He wants to choose the Negroes. He wants to choose the abolitionists who were frankly hated in his own state. And I think that that's a lesson for all of us, that the marginalized and vulnerable communities in our own time are the ones that are facing, real troubles and are in the need most of protecting democracy.
Yeah, when you were conveying that point that Lincoln's making in the book, it immediately made me think of things like his fragment on slavery, where he goes through that sort of logic piece of, oh, it's because of this or because of that. And it's like, be careful, because that same argument can be turned around on you the moment you meet someone who is, in one direction or another, more or less of this or that than you. But you also do point out that Lincoln had, because, I wondered as a reader too, I mean, about things like the lynching era and how common these things were. The McIntosh incident is referenced as potentially the first, or maybe the first documented lynching in America. But Lincoln had no shortage of examples, as you point out in the book. And one of the, just so that the audience has an idea about this, if he was looking for other incidents to condemn mob violence and the necessity of adhering to the rule of law, a Protestant mob in Massachusetts burned down a Catholic convent in the same time period. So what is the significance? And you articulate this in different ways throughout the book, the significance of him selecting these specific 3 events to make his point.
Well, I think the fact that each of them are racially charged events, abolitionism with Lovejoy, the fact that McIntosh is a black man, and the fact that these gamblers are accused of fomenting an insurrection, we would say, based on what we are quote unquote know about Lincoln, he would never do that because he's too cautious, he's too moderate. Lincoln would never, trouble his political career over this sort of thing. He's, just very down the middle. No, I believe he purposefully chooses these 3 racially significant charged events to make the larger point that not only is racism or slavery wrong, but that those wrongs are directly connected to the nature of our republic. And other speakers who are delivering Lyceum addresses before Lincoln and immediately after talk about dangers to American democracy. None of them address issues of race or slavery because they are practicing good politics. They don't want to touch that third rail in American politics. And let's be even more frank, Illinois, as I mentioned in the book, by the 1850s is going to ban the in-migration of blacks into the state. I mean, this is a free state. We don't want slavery here, but we don't want you black people here either. And so that's the kind of audience Lincoln is delivering this to. This is not a happy rah-rah message for a lot of people, I don't think. But the fact that Lincoln makes it says so much about him in his youth. And so I do think by the time Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation some 25 years later, he's doing so through an act of restoration rather than an act of becoming or culmination. He is returning to form, if you will, to the Lincoln of his late 20s who delivers this Lyceum Address.
I thought that was a really compelling argument, and also, and this ties another idea that you share in this book together too, is that he not only does he do this in the Lyceum Address, but that we see that also early in his political career. So, in the context of Illinois being a state where slavery was not legal, at the same time, you have the Illinois General Assembly issuing a statement condemning abolitionism, and Lincoln being one of the only people trying to get other people on board to lodge a formal protest to that. Can you talk about that? Why does that matter? Is it fair to say that Lincoln's arguments, that this really was risky for him to combine these two things, this idea of democracy for the least of us and all of us being essential?
Well, absolutely. Look, so much is happening in this roughly 1,000-day period between, July 4th, 1835 and January 1838 in Lincoln's life. And one of the things that happens is this is the first time he goes against slavery on the record, right? So Illinois, as you point out, the legislature passes a resolution condemning abolitionism. Why? Because these crazy white abolitionists from New England are coming in here with their anti-slavery pamphlets and ways, and they're crazy. They're disrupting our good Negroes and our good race relations here in Illinois. We don't want that. So they pass a resolution condemning abolitionism, and Lincoln says, hold on, how are we going to pass a resolution condemning abolitionism and not slavery? So he goes to, there were with Lincoln five people total in the state who thought that wasn't a good idea. And he goes to them, hey, you want to sign on with me to condemn slavery? And he can't find anyone. And he needs at least one other person to do so, because the rule in Illinois is that for it to be entered, the protest or the resolution to be entered into the record, you need two people to go on the record supporting it. Well, finally, Lincoln finds somebody, a guy named Dan Stone, who happens to like Lincoln, and guess what? Happens to be retiring. No shortage of politicians gaining courage at retirement. Dan Stone agrees to sign on with Lincoln, and they write a resolution condemning slavery. First time Lincoln goes on the record, and he recalls it. Years later, when he's being interviewed for an autobiography as he's running for president, he recalls the very page number of the Illinois Journal that the protest against slavery was entered into. Well, who remembers the page number? Well, Lincoln, it was seared in his brain, and I love that. He's trying to tell you something. I think, and I'm ranting here a little bit, but I think the South knew who Abe Lincoln was. They didn't secede. Southerners did not secede out of some misapprehension of ultimately what Lincoln's deepest beliefs were. I think they kind of read the man well.
Yeah, yeah. I want to dig a little bit into this, the issue of sort of abolitionists in general, because they were, in their beliefs, standing up for an issue. These were, and Lincoln refers to this, he acknowledges there are bad laws, but rather than just flout the law, he says we should use the processes we have to overturn bad laws. Abolitionists, by contrast, were often, calling for people to flout the law, burn the Constitution. Lincoln did not support that. But you also make the point that while Lincoln likely wouldn't have condoned the nonviolent civil disobedience of Henry David Thoreau or Martin Luther King Jr., he understood that that was vastly different in practice from the types of crimes being committed by these mobs, and that they were, Martin Luther King Jr. included, and did, willing to accept that if they were, engaging in civil disobedience and breaking the law, they might have to pay the legal consequences of that as well. Whereas the people who committed these horrific murders in Vicksburg and Alton and St. Louis did not face legal repercussions for that. How much was that distinction appreciated at the time, or was it?
I don't, from what I can tell, not much at all, Aaron, if at all. I think, a lot of the wisdom we have has come in hindsight, right? The owl of Minerva, as Hegel called wisdom, right? Or suggested it was, it flies only at dusk. And I think in hindsight, we've learned a lot. I hope we've learned a lot as a nation about those kinds of distinctions. And I think in that period of time, people struggled to teach that lesson. Certainly Thoreau and some of the transcendentalists of that period of time, had lots of objections around slavery and other things, right? The war in Mexico, but they were also willing to go to jail for them, right? It's a very Socratic thing to return to your home or stay home and face the consequences of a law that you are opposed to. This is an aside, but I remember reading about Muhammad Ali's opposition to the Vietnam War, and they asked him, why isn't he going to Canada? I'm not going to run away. I'm willing to pay the price. I don't think this is a right reason. I'm violating the law. Arrest me. Well, that's a kind of powerful, notion and virtue, I would say, to adhere to, that you're willing to make that sacrifice, right? It's, we talk about King, and it's the letter from a Birmingham jail, not the letter from Montreal or, or
Right.
wherever, right? So that's a powerful lesson in and of itself. Lincoln believed in the rule of law. And I think those who were performing acts of civil disobedience in his time understood that that meant facing consequences for your protests.
Yeah. I want to pivot now to the founders. Lincoln's view of the founding generation informed how he viewed the role of subsequent generations, including his own. How does he address this problem, that as hard as it is to create something, it can be that much more difficult to maintain it?
Not only, Aaron, more difficult to maintain something that has already been created, but not much incentive. Well, I joke in the book and elsewhere about the title, On the Perpetuation of Our, political institutions. That is not the sexiest title. Who wants to go down in history as having perpetuated our institutions? I mean, it's like, it's not that great. Let's be honest. But Lincoln believed it was deeply important. He also believed that starting something, namely self-government in the modern era, is where all the glory was. So he's aware of the glory and the field. The glory was harvested by the founders. They have the right to it. Our task, and he's always talking about tasks, as you know from Gettysburg, our task is to perpetuate what they founded, what they built for us, right, and to pass it on to future generations. He happens to believe that the challenge that he and his generation is facing in 1788, this is in 1838, this is 50 years after the ratification of the Constitution, is that the generation that founded the country is dying off. And they were the ones with the muscle memory of what it was like to build self-government. And that if we don't pay careful attention or if we don't educate ourselves about self-government, it will fade away completely. And we know, talk to students today or people who are unfamiliar with the generation that fought in the Second World War or the generation that fought in the Civil Rights Movement. Those generations are, dying off, sadly, right? They're not going to be with us forever. And day by day, the numbers of those people with the muscle memory of having fought fascism in World War II or racism in the South and elsewhere during the Civil Rights Movement, those people are dying off. And so it's our job to continue to educate people about that. And so in a sense, Lincoln is believing we have to channel the founders, but we also have to do it in ways that are unique because they're gone. They're gone. And so we have to, the only way we're going to get that muscle memory is through the hard work of education and revisiting what they learned or what they taught us. It's a powerful notion. And I think about it all the time in our own time about, Second World War, civil rights, other kinds of women's movement. There's so many movements that have happened that people, frankly, in this generation, my own children and I, frankly, wasn't alive for at times. And so, what do you do when that kind of moment seems to be seeping away because the people who were deeply engaged in it are no longer with us? I think it's a really impressive angle he takes at the Lyceum on that front.
So The Atlantic published an article today by Jeffrey Rosen called The Insurrection Problem, with the subtitle, Violence Has Marred the American Constitutional Order Since the Founding. Is it inevitable? And he enumerates various insurrections in the article, but pays particular attention up front to how the founders responded to Shays' Rebellion. And he notes, quote, Alexander Hamilton wondered if the rebellion would have had a different result if it had been headed by a Caesar or by a Cromwell. So I was obviously thinking about your book in the Lyceum Address as I was reading this. And he notes that Hamilton, Madison, and George Washington all shared similar concerns that this was evidence that the Articles of Confederation were flawed, part of what prompted the Constitutional Convention. But Thomas Jefferson, who was serving as American minister in Paris, apparently had a very different reaction. And he said, quote, the tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. It is its natural manure. Essentially, no big deal. Constitutional convention's an overreaction. And, you know, that if anything, this needs to happen from time to time. It's a good thing. is essentially sort of his conclusion there. It seems pretty clear to me that Lincoln didn't view insurrection as inevitable, or as Jefferson apparently did, essential to liberty and self-governance. But he wasn't quite Madisonian either. He knew the threat was there, but how did his view of democracy and the greatest threat to it differ from Madison?
Oh, it's great. Well, Madison he's always worried about everybody's a mob, had every Athenian citizen been a Socrates, every Athenian assembly would have still been a mob. Madison goes a little overboard at times, frankly. You read the Federalists, you read Federalist 10, he's a little bit, I'm not here to hate on Madison, but he's a little supercharged against popular rights. Let's call it that. He has worries about the people writ large. Lincoln, I think, has much more faith in the people. I think he thinks they've lost their way, but he doesn't want to build the kinds of structural impediments against them, I don't think, in quite the same way Madison does. Lincoln ultimately has a love for the people, of the people, by the people, for the people. Remember that? I mean, Lincoln believes in the people. I think you have to really strain your eyes to see Madison believing in the people. Madison believes in some people. He believes in structures. He believes in systems and checks and balances and a compound government. Lincoln believes we can get to the people and trust the people, but the people need education. People need to be perpetually trained in democracy, what Alexis de Tocqueville refers to as the habits of the heart. I was just joking with my students. I think it was a talk I gave recently. I was just joking that, you don't tell your partner, I love you once, and then, 20 years later come up and say, well, I told you that one time back in the 90s. It's not how it works. Democracy is a romantic enterprise. It requires a kind of idealism that's beautiful. The idea that someone on the train or the bus next to you or on the road next to you has the same rights to vote and privileges you do, even if you've been in this country many years longer than they do. But to get that belief to stick, it has to be really taught. And Lincoln spends a lot of time in the Lyceum Address talking about the need to do just that. Madison doesn't think you can really teach the mob. Frankly, I think what Lincoln thinks is that the people who have become induced or excited by the mob, who make up the mob, are people who have lost their way. They're not innately like that. We need to re-educate them, train them up in the right way. And so I think it's a fascinating difference, and I do have a little bit of interplay between Madison and Lincoln. It's not hard to see which side I tend to support, but I'm grateful that Madison is the father of the Constitution. I think there's some obviously tremendously valuable elements to our system of government, but faith in the people is, not a bright spot for Madison as I see it.
Yeah, but it is for Lincoln, as you rightly point out. Let's get into the education piece of it. You shared with us your education background. We're very involved as an organization in a lot of the collective efforts to restore, expand, uplift history and civics education in this country. And I have to say, especially in the civic space, everyone knows this speech. Anytime they find out what organization I work for, oh, Lincoln's Lyceum Address, it's viewed by many as a sort of manifesto for how and why history and civics education must be viewed as essential to a self-governing people. What does Abraham Lincoln mean by political religion? He has this oath, as you call it, that he goes through, and he talks about it being the political religion. How does that, what does he mean by that? And how does that translate to what you think we need today?
Well, I mentioned that about 18 months or so before this speech that Lincoln gives, the Lyceum Address, there's a white abolitionist in Illinois who writes an editorial. Actually, he delivers a speech that the Sangamo Journal, Lincoln's home newspaper, publishes. And his name is William Stewart. And William Stewart is a radical white abolitionist, and he writes about slavery being wrong, the shooting of the murder of McIntosh being horrible, the murder of the gamblers in Vicksburg being wrong. It's a beautiful speech, but almost in its entirety, it is coming at that from a religious angle. It is a very strong Christian bromide against slavery, which is powerful and I think in many ways wonderful. But Lincoln looks at that address, and I'm pretty sure he did, given his familiarity with the Sagamore Journal at the time, and he says, this is great stuff, but we need to secularize this. We need the kind of righteous indignation against the breaking the rule of law, but we need that not strictly in the language of scripture. We need a civil religion. We need to edify the Constitution and the Declaration and the rules by which we are governed to a high place. Let that be the kind of altar upon which we pray and regenerate our government. And so Lincoln wants to take those things and have it raised high. The way we may worship in a religious or spiritual sense is important, but what's equally important is that if we're going to believe in self-government, we have to have some things that are, nearly divine, that are absolutely deal breakers for us in terms of deviating from them. And that's what I think he views the Declaration, certainly, and the Constitution, and obeying the rule of law. I think those are the principles that he wants to esteem, and therefore those things have to be taught over and over again. Again, back to the kind of I gave a romantic model, but let's give a spiritual one. You don't pray once and say, well, God, it's 1973. I said that one prayer, right? If you're a spiritual practice, people may understand this, right? A spiritual practice is just that. It's something you engage in on a daily basis, right? Well, if you're going to have a civic practice of running a democratic republic, being a citizen in a democratic republic, then it's something you do every day. You don't just do it every 4 years. Teaching someone how to vote is good, but yearly or bi-yearly or quarterly elections, that's not going to cut it. What we need training on a regular basis. We need it in our blood, if you will, and that's where Lincoln is different.
Yeah, there's so much to being a citizen than just voting, as you say. So we have questions that we'll turn over to you here, but before I do that, I wanted to, you talk in the book about the Lyceum Address being part of what you refer to as Lincoln's dark trilogy. And so especially as we look at Lincoln's sort of return to some of these ideas or this courage, this lines up with that in some ways. The other two speeches you include in the dark trilogy are the Cooper Union, the House Divided speech, and the Second Inaugural. And in all three, he makes this point you referenced earlier about selective freedom. What do you mean by that?
Well, we can't have tiers, TIERS, to our government, right? We can't have tiers to our citizenship. The idea that some people are entitled to rights and liberties and others are not is antithetical to self-government. You're not really having a what you're having is a kind of autocratic system, that's going to innervate any opportunity for self-government or certainly democracy. And, in the House Divided speech, when he's talking about, I don't think the nation will stand all, half free or half slave. It'll either become one or the other altogether. Well, I think Southerners realize if Lincoln had to choose, we know where he would stand. And I think we all know Lincoln where he would stand. But his point is that, for something as fundamental as human freedom, we can't make, this is not, what age you get to drink. It's not that kind of a question, the price of, a ribeye in Indiana versus, Maryland. It's not that kind of question. It's too fundamental. It is the fundamental question, human freedom. And so we can't go halvesies and compromise on that. And by the same token, when we look at, the Second Inaugural Address, Lincoln realizes that, the price that we're paying now in the Civil War, in blood and lost lives and money, sunken treasure, is the price for having enslaved these people, other people, these African Americans for so many years, 250 years of unrequited toil, as he describes it. Well, and they're prophetic and powerful speeches, kind of Jeremiads in their own way, because it's like an if then kind of thing, a classic sermon, if you will, right? If you don't do this, Moses, this will happen. If you don't do this, people, this will happen, right? And if in the Lyceum, it's if we don't get our act together and have the rule of law for all, then we will commit national suicide. So,
yeah. All right, so Karen asks, how did Lincoln hear about Macintosh? And this relates to the second question we have from Michael, who wants to know where exactly the killing of Macintosh took place in St. Louis, and is there a marker?
So Lincoln heard about it from newspaper accounts. Either the Saginaw Journal ran newspaper accounts. There were a number of papers that Lincoln was reading. He had like 3 or 4 newspapers that he had real exposure to and took a liking to. And I think I list his favorite newspapers at the time. But the Macintosh killing was widely publicized. Charles Dickens writes about it, 7 years later. It becomes, an international affair. What was the second part of the question?
It was where exactly it took place, and is there a marker?
Last time I checked, there was no marker. I wanted to, the book is dedicated to Macintosh and to the survivors or victims of mob violence. And I feel like, it's extraordinarily important to commemorate these moments in our nation's history, the good and the bad, the evil, the dark and the light. And where was it? It's like 7th and Market Street or something like that, but it's precisely, I forget, there's some kind of technical building on the campus of Washington University in St. Louis, Wash U, where the actual killing took place. It's right there, and they have held memorials. The St. Louis Reparative Council, I think, forgive me if I'm not mentioning it exactly correctly here, it's in the book. They have commemorated the event, taking soil from that area and sort of blessing Macintosh's memory. There's that. But to my knowledge, there's no marker, no monument, certainly no memorial of any kind there. And perhaps it is being worked on or will be worked on. Because, I remember years ago, Toni Morrison putting benches in certain historical places where various crimes were committed, atrocities, frankly, just to remember that those people who lost their lives, and there would be like a little bench with a marker. I think part of the challenge, Aaron, is that, people think when we do that sort of thing, we're in some ways besmirching either the memory of the nation or the United States or our history, or making people feel uncomfortable. And I'm of the opinion, and I think a lot of Lincoln was of the opinion, that unless we confront these dark forces, we will repeat them over and over again. And he believed that part of our failure in the Civil War was we didn't confront the core problem of slavery, and that's why we were paying the price then. So I think anybody who's been in therapy knows you've got to confront that shadow side of yourself in order to move on and create opportunities for light to come in.
Yeah, a good example is that it was bipartisan local, regional, and national group that advocated for the Springfield 1908 Race Riot National Monument, which became a new part of the Park Service last year. It's managed with Lincoln Home National Historic Site, or NPS partners. And Kenneth Smith asks a question related to that incident in Springfield in 1908. And he asked if you think Lincoln knew, as he went to the White House, that Springfield, Illinois, while within a free state, what he asks was racist in a way that eventually led to the Springfield 1908 race riot so many decades later after Lincoln's life.
Well, I don't know this, specific incidents in Springfield that led Lincoln to feel that way, but I that might have led him to believe that. But I'm certainly sure he was well aware, because his own colleagues would not sign on to an anti-slavery statement in Springfield. He's certainly aware of their sentiments about Black people and others. Um, and I think that is in part what informed the next 25 years of his career. He understood that, you know what, I can hold the question of slavery and opposition to it dear to my heart. But if I'm going to be elected and move on, I'm going to have to, in some ways, tip my hat to white supremacy along the way. And he frankly did. And, I think ultimately, as he gains power and ultimately the ultimate power in the United States as president of the United States, we see him true to form, supporting an Emancipation Proclamation that members of his own cabinet were not thrilled about, to put it lightly. So yes, I think he was well aware of his constituents, of the people of Springfield and the larger population of Illinois. I think he was well aware. He's extremely astute politically, not just a pie in the sky guy. He understood it. But I think there's something about understanding it as a young man and still making the case, as he does in the Lyceum, in a very uncautious kind of way that is really empowering for all of us. Who among us is willing to be 1 out of 100 on a controversial question? I often ask myself that. Lincoln he was willing to stand alone. He and little Dan Stone, who was retiring. That's a lonely place for someone who's trying to make it in a state. I think that's what I take from it.
Yeah, well said. The courageous young Lincoln. So we have a lot of questions and we have about 4 minutes left. But one comes from Bob, who's a fellow grad of Georgetown School of Foreign Service. And his question is prompted by your past role as a high school teacher. And he says, do you think there's any value in the now pretty much obsolete requirement for young students to memorize Lincoln's Gettysburg Address?
No, I'm not a hater, if I can use that term, of memorization. No, I kind of rather like it. I wasn't called upon to memorize Lincoln, but I remember having to memorize, a speech by Mark Antony, oh, pardon me, thou bleeding piece of earth, that I am meek and gentle with these butchers, right? Thou art the ruins of the noblest man that ever lived in the tide of times. Woe to the hand that shed this costly blood, right? I'm sure I didn't appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I don't think I appreciated that maybe in the 8th grade or whatever it was that Ms. McGillicuddy or whoever the heck it was taught me that or made me do that. But I am not opposed to memorization on those kinds of things. I'm not saying memorization out of context. Yes, teach the context of the play, the novel, the story, the history. But I think it's good to have something a little bit embedded in you. No, I think it's valuable. I think it is worthwhile for the Gettysburg Address and other passages that make up who we are. For sure, absolutely. I'm all for it.
It's part of that shared experience too, that it's that can be of value. Linda wants to know if the Lyceum Address got a good reception at the time.
Hard to know. I wish I knew. I mean, I could tell you, make up something, and yes, Walter Cronkite that night, what was right there broadcasting. We don't know. We don't know how it was received. There's no account. We have the account published of the text of the speech, but we don't have how it was received. We only really have William Herndon years later saying it exceeded anything afterwards he ever was attempted in terms of oratory. It was sophomoric in its delivery and in maybe the style that he chose, but in terms of what he's trying to get at, it was a powerful thing. And that's Herndon remembering it decades later. So I don't know. I don't know how it was. Look, it was a Saturday night in January in Illinois. And as my Illinois friends might know, that, people were probably just anxious to get back into some warm quarters at that point, on January 27th in 1838. So I don't know, but I'm convinced that it means something to me. I'm convinced that it means something to us today. And I think that's ultimately what's important.
Yeah. Sarah notes that there was a lynching commission that led to a website about Macintosh, if not a physical marker. So thank you for that, Sarah. That's good to know. And Kevin asks, what sort of insurrection and why were the gamblers of Vicksburg suspected of fomenting insurrection? And so maybe this is also good to draw the timeline connection to the Nat Turner Rebellion.
Yeah, so Nat Turner's rebellion is 1831, and something on the order of nearly over 50 whites are murdered, including children, small children. It's a very vicious, horrific act, to say the least, over several weeks. And this puts the South, Southern plantation holders in particular, in a frenzy. And so there's this whole animated landscape of white Southerners fearing Black rebellions. And we see that take place in Mississippi. And it just so happens that the gamblers are already hated and mistrusted. And so they're a good target, for Virgil Stewart's pamphlet. So he can foment easily opposition to them, and then through them, Blacks who might be suspected, and so on and so forth. And so, which is part of what Lincoln is getting at, the people who we point fingers at and really loathe in society. Be careful about targeting them, because you're tapping into something really ugly that may have real repercussions for all of us. And I think that was one of the core lessons of the Lyceum.
Last question before we end, and I turn this back over to Phyllis. What's your next project?
My next personal project, I'm not 100% sure on. I mean, I have some thoughts about John F. Kennedy, but I'm not 100% sure. So I'll leave that. I am working on a collaborative project with my dear friend Benjamin Peters at the University of Michigan. We're working on something that is right now titled America's Lost Peace Dividend, and it has to do with how at the end of the Cold War, that window of time before 9/11 and thereafter, frankly, the transformation away from military spending to social spending, homeless crises, drug crises, and all kinds of infrastructure issues. Why that transfer of wealth never really went to the American people. And so Benji and I are exploring that in a book on America's Lost Peace Dividend, and we're writing it right now. It doesn't have a home yet, but we're in the middle of writing it. And as for me personally, I don't know. I've been thinking a lot about Kennedy lately, so we'll see. Stay tuned.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us, Dean. And folks, I hope you've enjoyed tonight's discussion with Dr. Saladin Ambar, and I encourage you to pick up this book, Murder on the Mississippi. It's a great read. It just got an excellent review also in the Wall Street Journal by our friend Harold Holzer. Phyllis, back to you.
All right. Yes, Dean, thank you so much for joining us this evening. It really has been wonderful to hear about your book, Murder on the Mississippi, The Shocking Crimes That Shaped Abraham Lincoln. So be sure and pick up your copy because they just came out. We hope that everyone with us this evening is already making plans to join us over the next several months for our fantastic lineup of authors and historians scheduled for our Fourscore Speaker Series. Next up, on Wednesday, November 5th, we will welcome back an entertaining duo, Dr. Jonathan White and Dr. Lucas Morrell, to discuss their book, Measuring the Man, The Writings of Frederick Douglass on Abraham Lincoln. As I noted earlier, we have a full fall schedule and a spring schedule of programming planned, including a special program on Lincoln's birthday, February 12th at 2 p.m. Central Time. So please visit our website at lincolnpresidential.org and register today. Finally, as you close out tonight's webinar, as always, we thank you in advance for taking a moment to complete a survey. And thank you for joining us this evening. And we look forward to seeing you all in November. Good night.